So if it hasn't escaped your notice, in the UK, it is now 2 p.m. on the 22nd of the 2nd, 22, which I find impressive. So this webinar today is called Language for Real Life, Developing Conversation Skills in English. And I'm Simon Wright, and I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager here at Cambridge University Press and Assessment. And I'll be hosting the webinar today with Adrian Doff, who's our presenter. So before I introduce today's speaker, I've just got a few admin things to talk about. The first point is that if you have a question for our speaker, please put this in the Q&A box and not the chat box. I think people now are using the chat box because that's how we started, but if you have a genuine question for our speaker, please add that to the Q&A box and we'll ask as many as we can at the end. I'm afraid we can't share the PowerPoint slides, but we will be recording this so you can watch it again, and the recording will be published on our YouTube channel sometime next week, and also available on our World of Better Learning blog as well. And I think we'll be putting up a link to the World of Better Learning blog so that you can check that out anyway. There's a lot of content on there. Also, if you want to register for another session, this is the first of 3 sessions that we're running. So if you want to sign up for any more sessions, then you'll see the link in the chat box. We'll be putting the link to the certificates as well in the chat box at the end of the session. So that won't come up before, so you'll have to wait till the end of the session before you can see that. And we'll also send a follow-up email where you'll have the chance to download the certificate. So don't worry if you miss it today, you'll also get an email because you're here because you registered for this talk. So let's keep moving. I'm very pleased to welcome Adrian Doff, who'll be talking to us today about language for real life, developing conversation skills in English. And we can see him now. Hi, Adrian.
Hello. Hi. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, all good.
All good. Okay.
Adrian Doff has taught English and trained teachers in several countries and now lives in Germany, where he works as a freelance ELT writer and teacher trainer. He's written many books for Cambridge University Press, including course books, Meanings into Words, so I'll say that again, Meanings into Words, Language in Use, and English Unlimited, and the teacher training course, Teach English. He's also co-author of Cambridge's adult course, Empower. And you'll probably see the logo in the top corner of the screen for Empower. So that's it from me for the moment. So don't forget, put your questions in the Q&A box, and over to Adrian. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you very much for coming to this webinar, wherever you are. I'm speaking from Munich, where it's late-ish afternoon, but I guess for most of you it's more like morning. Anyway, thank you for coming and taking part in this webinar, which is on the topic of developing conversation skills in English. And the kind of area we're looking at then in the webinar is face-to-face interaction between people, which may, of course, involve fairly short exchanges like offering things to people or asking the ways to somewhere, but very often involves more elaborate interaction over a longer period. For example, here are just some here are some examples of common kinds of interaction, just to give a feel of the kind of areas we're talking about. So expressing opinions, responding to other people's opinions, deciding together on a course of action, getting to know someone, finding things in common, asking for advice, giving advice, explaining a process, asking for and giving recommendations. So there are all situations where there might be quite an extended kind of interaction. And I will be considering 2 questions about this area. One is, what is involved in interacting successfully? And then secondly, how can we help learners to improve? And in answering the second question, I'll be using examples taken from American Empower, of which, as Simon told you, I am one of the authors. Just to focus on the first question, what I'd like to do is to look at an example of 2 learners interacting with each other. And I've taken as a sample a clip from a Cambridge exam, which is a beta exam. Cambridge First used to be called First Certificate. Part of the exam is a speaking test, and as part of that exam, there is a section where learners have to interact with each other. I should just say at this point, perhaps, that I'm not concerned here with exam skills or with testing or assessment or anything like that. This is really just a convenient sample of learner interaction, of two learners talking at a kind of intermediate plus level, above intermediate level, in what I hope is a fairly natural situation. Obviously, it's an exam, so it's not entirely natural, but I think it's an example of relatively spontaneous speech. Okay, so what they're doing in this clip is they have a task which they're given, which you can see here. So they have to discuss together ideas for attracting tourists to the town they're in, and they consider various possibilities like building houses, providing places to stay, having more shops, and so on. And they come to a conclusion. They try to reach a conclusion about this and reach agreement about it. As it's a test, of course, they're being assessed as well. So there's an assessment scale of a kind which you're probably quite familiar with different assessment categories related very much to the Common European Framework, actually. So one is grammar and vocabulary, both accuracy and range. One is how they manage the discourse, manage the conversation. One is focusing on pronunciation. And there is also a column of interactive communication. In other words, how successfully they communicate with each other. And it's this last column that I would like to focus on particularly. So if I just zoom in on the mid-range of this column, hope you can read that all right. I'll just move my, yes, move mine up here. So in what we're looking at then is how well they can initiate and respond appropriately, and how well they can maintain and develop the interaction and negotiate towards an outcome. So you're going to watch this clip then of them talking. You're going to see Victoria, who is a German speaker. I think she's probably from Switzerland. I'm not sure, either Germany or Switzerland. And Edward, who is a Spanish speaker, and he comes from Peru. And as you watch, just to focus this, you might actually just look at this question on the left and decide which of these statements you agree with. Do you think they aren't able to respond to each other effectively, that they can communicate, but they're using a limited range of expressions, or that they express themselves fluently and appropriately? Which one do you agree with most? And by all means, jot down your answers in the chat column if you like, or just think about it. So let's listen to them.
Maybe we can choose one.
Yeah, okay. Won't we like to talk about building nightclubs? What do you think about it?
Maybe nightclubs, I think, are focused for young people. I think that not young people like to visit towns for a nightclub. What about having more shops? I think that shopping is a special thing.
Shops is, I think, as well a good idea, because they can go with the whole family, or sometimes parents can go on their own and the children's are for their own. But I think it would be nice when it is a shopping area and not shops on the street, because when the children want to go alone, maybe it is a little bit dangerous.
So maybe we can agree providing more parks.
Parks.
Yes.
I don't really like parks, so because I don't want to have a picnic in the park, but maybe it is nice. What do you think about it?
Well, sorry, I can't agree with you. I like parks because most people like to spend time with their family doing a picnic on free air if it's a good weather. So maybe more tourists can go to the parks.
Yeah.
Well, but maybe we can. What do you think about building holiday flats?
I think it is a good idea, but I'm not really sure if everybody wants to live in a holiday flat. But I think it can be very interesting when it's nice. Yeah, and it's a nice flat. What's your opinion?
I think that is not good for tourists.
Okay, so that's the end of the clip. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to see your chat responses without stopping the video. So my own opinion about this is, well, I think there are strengths and weaknesses in what they say. In generally, I would go for B, I think. Seems to me that, well, certainly they can communicate, they can achieve the task, they can get across their ideas, but they tend to rely, I think, on fairly basic expressions for this level. And I think this is very important. We're talking here about B2 level. So they use basic expressions like we can and how about, but they have a rather limited range, especially, I would say, of functional language. So it seems to me that they're not really equipped to express themselves appropriately as fully as they might do at this level. I'd like to drill down into this and look a bit more in detail at some of the things that they say. And well, here are the language functions that they use. Now, this is what they're doing in their conversation. They're organizing the task, they're making suggestions about what they should do. They're weighing up alternative ideas, playing around with different possibilities. They're speculating, they're imagining things, what possible solutions might look like. And very importantly, they're taking turns, and especially they're agreeing, they're disagreeing, and they're asking each other for opinion. So within each of these categories, I'd just like to look with you at what they actually say, and also then look at what they might say or what might be a more appropriate way of using the language at this level. So let's look then, first of all, at the way they organize the task and they make suggestions for what to do. This is what they actually said.
Maybe we can choose one.
Yeah, okay. Won't we like to talk about building nightclubs?
Okay. So I think, well, this does its job. I mean, they communicate with each other absolutely fine, and they understand each other, but they're not really using appropriate expressions for making suggestions. When we like to talk about, I think, is what you'd say in German, actually, wollen wir nicht darüber sprechen. But perhaps better would be something like this. Maybe we should choose one and talk about it. Why don't we start talking about it? Partly, I think this is a question of choice of modal verbs, isn't it? So maybe should would be a better choice here than can. If we look at weighing up alternative ideas, this is what they said.
What about having more shops? So maybe we can agree providing more parks.
Okay, again, they get the ideas across all right. They're using fairly basic expressions for making suggestions here. But I think what would be quite good here would be to, what they don't do is really express the language of weighing up ideas, which might require something a little bit more elaborate, I think, at this level, like, well, another idea would be to, or, well, maybe we could, this idea of playing around with different ideas. And I think this is, of course, a question of level. I mean, what they say would be absolutely fine at A2 level, but I think at B2 level or post-intermediate level anyway, this is perhaps a little bit limited. Then they speculate, they imagine things, and in particular, Victoria says this.
I don't want to have a picnic in the park, but maybe it is nice. What do you think about it?
Okay, so she uses present simple here. When I first heard this, I wasn't immediately sure what she meant by this, whether she meant I don't like having picnics, or whether, and I think what she actually meant was, well, I wouldn't want to have a picnic, but maybe it could be nice. So again, it's a question of modal verbs and not really using would or could. I think it's quite surprising, actually, that given the kind of level she's at, that she doesn't use would and could, or wouldn't and couldn't, because these are fairly sort of basic expressions. And this is something I want to pick up in a minute about the reasons why perhaps she doesn't use this language for speculating. Let's move on, though, to look at turn taking. And here I've included a little bit more of the context in the clip so you can see what they're trying to say. This is what they say when they disagree, and this is what they say for asking an opinion.
But maybe it is nice. What do you think about it?
Well, sorry, I can't agree with you.
But I think it can be very interesting when it's nice. yeah, and it's a nice flat. What's your opinion?
Okay. I think it's interesting, this one, because on the face of it, I think, what they're saying is perfectly correct. Seems fine. It's the expressions probably that they've learned for this. But when I started thinking about it, I thought, well, what would I actually say? I don't think I would disagree in that way or ask for an opinion in that way. I'd probably say something more like this for disagreeing. Yeah, I'm not sure about it. Or I don't know, something like that. And for asking for an opinion, I'd say, well, what's your opinion, but what do you think? So I think these expressions they use are perhaps, they're perhaps rather formal set expressions which seem a bit cut and dried. Again, this is something we'll pick up on in a minute. Okay, so let's just to kind of pull this together, to summarize a bit, I think there are certain key features that run through what they are saying, which are quite important for their ability to communicate effectively in these areas. One of them is the use of softening language, hedging language, softening, things like, maybe, perhaps, I don't know, what do you think, I'm not sure, and so on, which was noticeably lacking in the language that they used, but I think would be quite important, given that they're not having an argument with each other, they're trying to reach a conclusion together. So I think it's quite important that, they use strategies for not treading on each other's toes, for allowing each other a bit of space using this kind of language. Another important feature, I think, is this hypothetical language using would or could that's required here. And as I noted earlier, I think it's quite surprising that Victoria especially doesn't use this language because, as I'm sure we all know, would and could are actually very basic, very high frequency words in English. If you look at any corpus of the language, any international corpus, for example, Cambridge International Corpus, either American English or British English, doesn't matter. Both would and could are listed as among the top 200 words. In other words, the 200 most frequently used words in the English language. So in other words, they're very basic, very common words indeed. Another indicator of this, which I think tells us something, is from the English grammar profile. Maybe that you're familiar with this. If you're not, I can strongly recommend it as a very useful resource for teachers. You can have free access to it. Just have to Google it. Just Google English grammar profile online, and you'll get to it. There is also a vocabulary profile, which focuses on vocabulary. And what this does is it's based on research into mainly learners' English, and it indicates what grammatical items you could expect learners to know or to use or be ready to learn at particular levels. And as you can see here, they've got the modal verb would is listed as an A2 level word in exactly the situation that we saw Victoria and Ed were using for imagining situations. So in other words, it's a basic level word. I don't know why she doesn't use would, but obviously we can't tell. But I suspect it may be because I think would is often taught a bit later at intermediate level or beyond in English course books, because it's often taught as part of the second conditional. And it may be that she's just learned it in that context only. And again, this is something I'm going to pick up again later. Let's move on, though, to a third feature, which is the formality level of the language, which I put here as formal. I think it's not formal versus informal, but more formal versus neutral language. And we saw that some of the expressions they use were actually quite formal expressions. So if we look at, for example, these two different ways of disagreeing, I don't agree, I think is fairly formal. It's also, I think, quite assertive, isn't it? So I don't think I would say I don't agree unless I really felt very strongly. I was really kind of banging on the table and insisting. Much more neutral and also more tentative is, oh, I'm not sure about that. I don't know, expressions like that. And I think these seem to me more useful, possibly, to teach to learners than the form I don't agree. Okay, so if we look back at these criteria that we saw earlier, and if I zoom in again on the mid-level one of communication, it seems to me that these features play quite an important role in how well they initiate and respond appropriately, and also how well they maintain and develop the interaction and negotiate towards an outcome. Okay, so if these are important features and useful features of the language, this brings us on to the question then of, well, what can we do about it? How can we help learners to develop speaking skills? And I think an important point here is that a lot of these expressions that we looked at, they're not particularly complex, they're not particularly difficult, but they are highly idiomatic. In other words, they're not the same between different languages. So I don't think we can assume that learners will just pick these expressions up, unless, of course, they're actually in a country surrounded by native speakers. But otherwise, I think it's necessary to focus on them in some way and to teach them, if you like. So what I'd like to move on now to is how we might go about doing that, how we might help learners develop speaking skills. And I'm going to be looking at 4 different aspects of this. One is context and the importance of showing language in situational context and linking language to situations. Another one is noticing, in other words, ways of getting learners to notice what expressions are used and notice features of language. Then the third one is activation, in other words, how to get learners using the language and incorporating it into their repertoire of language, as it were, giving them practice in the language. And the fourth one is awareness, by which I mean helping learners to be aware of meaning and form, and also differences in meaning between different expressions. So let's have a look first of all at context. And I'd like to look again at this expression, at the use of would for speculating and imagining. We said earlier that it may be that learners don't learn would in connection with situational phrases, because it is often taught mainly in connection with the second conditional as an if clause. And if you look at these examples of these are coursebook examples from second conditional sentences, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. If you look at these, they're not particularly connected to context, are they? So, of course, it's possible to think of contexts in which you might use them. And of course, in coursebooks, they often are linked to some kind of context. They're taught in context, but there's no particular situation that springs to mind to me when I look at these sentences. By contrast, if you look at the word would not used in an if sentence, but just as a word, if you like, it is very closely linked to everyday situations of all kinds. And if you look at these situations, I think you can see that it very strongly suggests the kind of context of situation in which it is used. I'll just pause just for a moment to give you a chance. Just look at these 3 examples. They're all separate, of course. And just see what context springs to mind for you. What do you think is going on? Where are these people? What are they doing? I'll just pause for a moment. So the first one, I think, might be, what it suggests to me is it might be in a shop trying on shoes, might be emptying out a cupboard, perhaps looking at things you've got to wear. Second one might be perhaps people looking around an apartment, thinking of renting an apartment, thinking about the room, maybe reorganizing an office, could be planning a cafe or a restaurant, something like that. Third one, I think, is probably less connected with a situation, but I think you could easily imagine, well, it might be some way of reacting, I think, reacting to a picture perhaps, or some news about somebody who's perhaps doing something dangerous, like paragliding or ice climbing or something like that. So I think this immediately suggests context of situation. And I think what this suggests is that would used alone is very much linked to conversational English in everyday contexts. I'd just like to show you an example of this, of how would is shown in context. This is taken from American Empower. And it's a situation where these guys, in fact, it's the second situation we talked about just now. They're looking around an apartment and they're just imagining what might be in it. Just to focus your attention as you watch this, sorry, as you listen to this, it's only audio. As you listen to this, just think about, well, why do they use would and could in this conversation? They're looking at the apartment and they're talking to the rental agency, the lady from the rental agency.
This one's just come up for rent. I think you might like it better. Have a look around and see what you think.
Thanks. This one's nice. Think we can afford it?
Well, it's a pretty cool place.
Look, this could be a separate living area by the window.
Yeah, we could put some plants and bookshelves there, or a big lamp.
Yeah, that would work.
And this would make a great dining area. We could have a table and some cool lights.
And I can imagine a big TV right here.
So, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a great space.
Well, we have had some other people looking this morning, so if you're definitely interested...
We'll think about it.
Okay, so clearly they use would and could here because they're just imagining. They don't know if they're going to buy the flat or not. They're just playing around with ideas, rather like Victoria and Edward did in the extract that we saw earlier. So this is an example then where I think it's important, of course, to introduce would as part of second conditional structures, but it's also important to introduce it in a more lexical way, linked to conversational functions and situations. And there are many grammatical items that I think this applies to. Here are some examples. For example, must, which is often introduced as obligation, isn't it? Contrasted with have to, don't have to, mustn't. Not actually very common, I think, in that context, because it's a very strong word, but it's very common in a completely different use with functions like recommending, for example, like you must visit that restaurant, it's great. Ending a conversation, I must go now. Very importantly, empathizing with people. Oh, that must have been terrible. Or, that must be really difficult. That must be great, that kind of language. That, at a much lower level, usually introduced for pointing to things, this, that, these, those, and so on. But as corpus shows very clearly, by far the commonest use of that is in reacting in conversations. That's great, that's nice, that's awful, that's interesting, that's a good idea, and so on. Echo questions, often neglected in grammar, but very important, and responding. Did you, were you, was it, was she, and so on. Past continuous is quite interesting. I think that it's nearly always taught in connection with narrative, of course, and contrasted with the past simple, which is a very important use of it, but a completely different use is in conversation, in returning to a topic. Like, as I was saying, what were we talking about? Expressions like that. And reported speech and thought often introduce, people often wonder, is it really, do we really need to use reported speech at all? And I think one situation where you definitely do need reported speech and thought is when you're clarifying. So things like, I thought you said we were going out at 9 o'clock, or did you say I had to download this kind of expression. Future continuous, again, often left until very late, a very advanced structure, and used for this sort of rather obscure use of talking about ongoing situations at some point in the future, which is quite hard for learners to get their mind around, I think. But a much commoner use of the future continuous is for announcing things, announcing a program of pre-planned events. So, for example, in this webinar, I'm sure at the beginning, I probably said something like, well, in this webinar, we'll be looking at blah, 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 and so on. So that's a very important use of it in conversation. Okay, so I think this indicates the importance of not only teaching grammar, as part of structure, but also teaching it more lexically in conversation. And in American Empower, in fact, we take a sort of dual approach to this. So the first 2 lessons in units deal with grammar and vocabulary and also skills and general speaking skills. But there is also a 3rd lesson in every unit which focuses on these conversational functions and, if you like, in parallel or sort of recycles some of this language. Okay, let's look fairly quickly at noticing and just picking up on the same context we saw with these guys looking at an apartment. A next stage might be to get students to notice this language. This is a technique we use quite a lot in American Empower, of just having extracts with gaps, and learners either try to recall what they heard, or they guess what the person says, and then they check. So if I just zoom in on this. So that's what they said, heard could be, could have, would make, and could imagine. So it's noticing what language is used. In this case, quite important because, in fact, the would and the could is rather swallowed when you hear it. So this would make a great dining area. So quite important just for students to notice what it is that was said, which then leads on, of course, to practice of contracted forms. So I think that's one stage. And then following on from that, another stage is getting students to activate this language. And I think this is really important, that students have a chance not just to do kind of form-focused exercises and then free activities, but a stage of, if you like, semi-controlled practice. So here's an example. Students sit in 2 pairs. One pair looks at this room, one pair looks at this room, and they imagine what furniture they might put in it. Okay, they imagine they're renting this space, they're going to have an apartment there. What would they put in it? And then this might move on to a slightly freer activity where students look at their classroom and they imagine it as an office, a library, an apartment, maybe other things, maybe a cafe or a restaurant as well. And they discuss what they would put in it, what it might look like. I think this is very important because it's a chance, it's a kind of safe space for students to become familiar with the new expressions, play around with them, develop what is often called automaticity, sorry. In other words, that they become able to use this new language automatically without thinking about it, develops their confidence, and also helps them to start to own the new expression. So it becomes part of their language repertoire, if you like. So I think some of this sort of succession of activity would, thinking back to Victoria and Edward, something of this kind would help them to develop automaticity and to get ownership of using would and could in their discussion. Okay, I'd like to look now at a final area, which is awareness. By which I mean helping students to develop awareness of meaning and form and differences between expressions. In the case of would and could, I think this is not so important because they're just single words, but it would be very important if we're introducing a range of different expressions. And so I'd like to move now to use a different example, a different area of language, but also one that Victoria and Ed will be using, which is giving and responding to opinions. So the language of discussion, in other words, and agreeing and disagreeing. And I'd like to give you an example, which is not from Empower. In fact, it's not a Cambridge coursebook, but it is from a coursebook which I didn't teach myself, but I observed a lesson with a trainee who gave this lesson. And I think what often happens with teaching areas like this or dealing with areas like this at intermediate level and above is learners are given a range of expressions which they can draw on in an activity. And that's what happened in this lesson. Learners listened to a discussion, they picked up some of the language, and then they had this list of ways of giving opinions, agreeing, partially agreeing, and disagreeing. They did a short form focus exercise, I think, with sort of choosing correct items. And then they had a discussion themselves and they drew on these expressions. They had these to hand to include in their discussion. I think the trainee teacher was quite happy with this lesson because the students had a good discussion and they did use some of these expressions. I personally had reservations about it because it seemed to me that it was problematic in certain ways, dealing with it in this way. And I think these are some of the problems with this approach. One is that I think, well, maybe there's just too many items. So do you really need so many different ways of agreeing and disagreeing? Probably more important than that, I think some of these are a bit too complex. If you're thinking of kind of B1 plus level, I'm in favour of doing is quite high level expression, I think. The way I see it, this kind of embedded relative clause. So some of them are quite advanced expressions. I think there's a great temptation above intermediate level to introduce complex language for talking about things, more difficult ways of saying these things. But I think it also includes quite low frequency and also quite formal expressions. So, for example, I agree to some extent, but, or you have a point there, but. I can't imagine I would ever say that myself unless I was in quite a formal situation involved in quite a formal discussion. So maybe not very appropriate expressions. And also, I think a very important point is that not all these expressions are equivalent. I mean, they're presented as equivalent expressions, but they're not, are they? I mean, like, for example, fair enough has a particular use for kind of grudging acceptance. I'm still not convinced would only be appropriate after you've had a long argument. You've finally sort of given up arguing about it, and so on. So there are differences in meaning which are important here. So they're not all equivalent. So if these are problems with this approach, what are the solutions to this? It seems to me that a solution would be to have fewer items and more useful items, and also to teach appropriate items rather necessarily than teach more and more complex items. And also, and very importantly, to develop learners' awareness of how the expressions are used, what the difference is between them, and focus on form and meaning as well. Just like to show you an example of this. This example is taken, it's not from the main course book of American in Power, but it's from some supplementary material which we developed for both British and American in Power, actually. So it's not specifically American, it's more international, with a range of speakers, American, British, and also non-native speakers. And it's intended for learners who are using in Power with the intention of studying, going to university or college and studying in English. So it's English, if you like, for general study purposes, so general, broad academic purposes. And in this example, what you're going to hear is a discussion. These are business students, and what they're discussing is the pros and cons of family-run businesses. So focusing especially on small-scale businesses, I think, which are very often family-run, but also possibly larger businesses as well. They're going to write a project on this, which is why they're discussing it. And as you listen to this, just notice what language do they use to take turns, and especially what language do they use to agree and disagree.
Okay, pros and cons of family-run businesses.
Yeah.
Should we talk about the good points first? Yeah?
Okay. Well, loyalty. That's obviously one strong point. Loyalty to the family. So the company stays together in bad times and they help each other. Maybe that wouldn't happen so much in an ordinary company.
Yeah, that's right. Also, family-run businesses have a kind of inbuilt support system. That's what you're saying, really, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. They stick together.
Yes.
And I think flexibility is another one. Like if you think of a shop or a cafe, for example, if one person has a family commitment, say a school trip or something, someone else in the family can usually take over, so they can be more flexible.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, support system and flexibility. Right. Anything else about that?
Not really.
You wanted to say something, Carlos?
Yes. Another thing is they usually share the same values.
Yeah, that's true.
So there's a kind of family set of values. They all agree on what the company represents. It's a kind of company mission in a way.
I'm not sure. I think that depends, doesn't it? I mean, I see what you mean, but still the family may not all see things in quite the same way. Not always.
Okay. So these were some of the expressions. I mean, this continues a bit. There are a few more as well, as you probably noticed. So I got, yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. I'm not sure. And I see what you mean. But, okay, so this is kind of noticing stage, similar to what we looked at before. And then there is a stage which I think is quite important, which focuses on the meaning of these expressions. So first of all, sorting out which ones are for agreeing and which ones are for disagreeing, which makes the point, of course, that saying things like, I'm not sure, and I see what you mean, but are ways of disagreeing in English, which may not be obvious. And then also focusing on particular meanings, like which one means I completely agree, which one means I understand your opinion, but I don't agree. And then a focus on intonation of the expressions, which is clearly very important with agreeing and disagreeing. So learners listen again to extracts and they decide which ones rise or stay high at the end, which ones fall or stay low at the end. I won't play this to you again. And from this, they establish that we often use a rising tone when we disagree, don't we? So we may use a rising tone when we agree, but we use it especially when we disagree. And we do this because it sounds less aggressive. So in other words, it's to do with hedging and with softening of our language. And when we agree, by contrast, we usually use a falling tone. So the contrast here is between, yes, that's a good point, or yes, exactly, and I'm not sure, and using that kind of rising intonation. This would then lead on to practicing that intonation and also then integrating the expressions and using them in a discussion themselves. So points about this, I think, is that this uses an example of using simpler expressions, which are higher frequency and possibly more useful, but expressions which are appropriate to the context and which are neutral or fairly informal. So avoiding formal language, including speaking strategies such as softening, we saw here, and developing awareness, not just giving them the expressions, but developing awareness of meaning and form and also intonation. So I think a general conclusion here is that, as in architecture, as in the cases of this building, but also as in English language teaching, less is often more. In other words, it may often be better to introduce less language and do more with it, and perhaps introduce simpler language, which is going to be more useful, rather than exposing students to a whole range of different expressions, which they may not absorb and may not be so useful for them. And that brings us to the end of this webinar, really. So just to conclude, these were the questions I presented at the beginning. What is involved in interacting successfully? And I think this is what we saw, that it's really especially using functional expressions and speaking strategies, which play a very important role in, if you like, developing communicative competence and are important to focus on, in addition to focusing on broader grammar and vocabulary areas. And so how can we help learners to improve? Well, therefore, by focusing on functional language and speaking strategies, not as an alternative to grammar, but in addition to it, and providing a clear context, linking it very closely to situations and introducing fewer items, but with a stronger focus on meaning, form, and pronunciation. And this was really the approach that we took in American Empower, was to pay attention to these language areas in addition to grammar and vocabulary. And that's it. So thank you very much for listening and also for taking part in the chat. Those that did so, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Adrian. That's great. Thank you very much for that. We do have a bit of time actually for questions, so we've got a couple in at the moment. But if you want to ask a question for Adrian, now's your chance, because we've only got a couple in, so I'll probably definitely ask it if it's a good one. So yeah, thanks for that. I mean, for me, you know, it's a big step, isn't it? The real language from just normal classroom interaction at the lower level, where it's like, what did you do at the weekend? And it's a one-way traffic. when you're introducing that interaction, that becomes becomes a whole different game with all new vocabulary that you need to use. But I like the less is more, definitely. You'd probably have your go-to things that you would how you would respond or react. So yeah, let me just start off by asking the first question here, which was from an anonymous person, but it says, what's Adrian's favorite technique / way to develop his German speaking skills?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. Okay, as I mentioned, well, I'm living in Germany, so I mean, I'm very privileged in that way. So I'm surrounded by German speakers, and I use German a lot as well. What I remember, though, was, which I think is connected with what I've been talking about. I actually learned German at school before I went to Germany, and I remember when I first came to Germany, this kind of functional language was exactly the language that I didn't know how to use. In fact, I was very good at grammar. I knew quite a lot of vocabulary. After a time, I became more fluent. But it was, even as a very simple level, I couldn't really use these kinds of expressions in German. Because I'm living in Germany, of course, I picked them up from other people. Okay. So this example we heard with Victoria. She said, won't we want to talk about, okay, which I mentioned was, this is what you say in German, wollen wir nicht etwas sprechen, yeah? When I came to Germany, of course, I had no idea that was what you said. And so I said it's in directly translating an English way, yeah. Well, so I translated, why don't we do that, or something like that.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean.
And so I think, that this underlines, the importance. I mean, if we're teaching people who are not in the country, then it's really important, I think, to expose people to those expressions. I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, it's actually a very wide question. My favorite way of developing German speaking skills is at the moment, because I'm a fairly advanced German speaker, is actually to spend a lot of time reading German newspapers, which I find, going right away from this topic, I actually find it is an extremely powerful way of improving my language. But that's a different topic for a different occasion.
I guess the teacher can play a huge part. I'm just thinking about critical thinking. Instead of just listening to a response, then you could maybe come back with a, why do you think that? What do other people think? So I guess the teacher can really kind of expand on the interaction part of and how to respond in the classroom. I guess it's up to the teacher to do that, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Another question here. Let's have a look at the one here. Could you? This is a nice one. I like this. Could you be so kind and explain once again how might a non-native speaker feel all the shades of meaning while choosing the most suitable expression? So how do you know exactly which kind of expression to use in the right context, in the right situation?
I mean, it's a good question. It's very difficult, isn't it? And I think that this is my point with showing you these this whole range of expressions. When we look at all these expressions, all these different ways of agreeing and disagreeing, I think we can quite easily see which ones would be appropriate in what situation and what the fine differences of meaning are between them. Although even when I look at them, I have to kind of think about it, I think. But it's actually impossible, I think, for learners to know this, and especially to get this idea of, what's a more formal expression in English, what's a less formal expression in English. And so I think that's a reason why, as a teacher, my answer to this would be to focus on far fewer expressions. So it's possible to make it clear. I mean, the way I do it as a teacher is by asking guiding questions, by concept questions, by giving examples and context, getting students to see themselves what the differences are in meaning and connotation, I think.
Thank you. There's a question here from Ludmilla. It says, Adrian, do you recommend asking students to compare these English ways of expressing different functions with how it goes or how it is in their native language? It's sometimes very different or more straightforward. Or
yes, I would. Yes, I would actually. I mean, I think if you have this possibility, I think this is. I know very often in teacher training, people are dead set against using the native language or referring to the native language. But I think to me that is an extremely valuable use of the native language if you can do this to make these comparisons.
Yeah.
I think one point here that's really important actually is that there is clearly a cultural dimension here, isn't there, to this? So, for example, with agreeing and disagreeing, I talked about this sort of softening and saying things like, "Well, I'm not sure," and maybe, and so on. I think there's a cultural dimension in that, in both American English and British English. I'm sure it's the same. That in English, people tend to be more tentative, to use softening, to use hedging, especially when they're disagreeing, than they do, say, in other languages. So, for example, German is very different in that way. And because of that, Germans have quite a lot of difficulty, I think, when they're learning English. That they tend to come across as too kind of definite and too cut and dried, or even a bit too arrogant or aggressive. They don't mean to be, but it's simply they're transferring what is quite acceptable in German, but isn't in English. And I'm sure it applies to other languages too. So I think that's, if your learners are going to be using English with other speakers of English, this is an important dimension to what they're learning. So I think the answer, the way to deal with this is to make sure that it becomes clear to learners, through context, through examples, through not trying to teach too much at the same time, I would say.
Sure. Another question here from Maria. Some of my students confess that while they are speaking, they can concentrate on either vocabulary or grammar, but not both at the same time. How can I help them with this?
That's a very interesting question.
Yeah, you're focusing on what you're getting right or wrong, but you're not focusing on what you're going to say next, I think.
Yeah. I think, I'm not sure I'm really answering this question, but what occurs to me, I think part of the answer here is that we don't always have to teach grammar as grammar. And I think that's what I was suggesting really with these examples with would. People think sort of, well, would is tremendously difficult. We have to teach the second conditional. We have to practice it. And so learners are then really focused on the grammatical structure, which I'm sure is part of the reason why they're a bit paralyzed and they're kind of blocking out language fluency a bit. But it seems to me, we can, sure, we can do that, but we can also give practice in would simply as a word, treat it lexically as well. Or as a functional phrase. And I think if we do both these things at the same time, then, if we link would to a situation and treat it just as a word, then learners aren't, they're not thinking about grammar at that point. They're thinking about using a word. So I think maybe that helps a bit. It's moving from grammar perhaps to a more lexical approach to teaching.
Thank you. Another question here from Lydia is how much time, I think this is in reference to the 4 different points that you had, one of the, context, etc. So it's how much time should be devoted to each of these aspects during the class?
Well, that's an interesting question, yeah. I think, obviously it depends. It depends how much of a range of language there is, what kind of difficulty there is with the language, of course. I would think that of the 2 areas that I mentioned, I think context needs really devoting a lot of time to, because I think it's very important for learners to see the language in a proper context. So it's worth having a developed situation, make use of pictures, make use of recordings, and so on, make use of examples as well for that part of it. And I also think that what I talked about as the activation stage, I think I would also devote sufficient time to. I think it's really important not just to go straight from introducing language, getting students to notice it, and then straight into a kind of free activity, because I think that learners need this chance to kind of get their heads around new expressions, to develop this automaticity. And so I would personally devote quite a lot of time to semi-controlled practice of different kinds, giving learners situations, making use of pair work, making use of group work, having activities with a chance to repeat the task, have another shot at using the language. That seems to be a really important stage. So of those things, with the proviso this, it depends. I would want to make sure that those 2 things have got adequate coverage.
Yeah, excellent. I think you're right there. Sort of, repetition, using it in as many ways as you can to make it stick in your brain. So I think there's about 1 minute left, so I'm just going to sign off now, just to thank Adrian again. So thank you very much for that, and to thank everybody for coming along. And there's another webinar. We've got a series of 3 webinars, as I said, and we hope you can join us for the next one, which is on the 16th of March. We've got one in February, the one we've just had now, one in March and one in April. 16th of March is with Craig Thane, and he's going to be talking about assessment and motivation. So you can register for this with the link that I think will be put into the chat box now. I shall just make sure that's going in there. Yeah, there you go. I think there's some links there to register for that on our World of Better Learning page. Sorry about the sound of the dishwasher. I didn't realize that was going to be on. Thanks very much again, Adrian, and yeah, please sign up for the other webinars. I hope you've enjoyed it today. Some nice comments coming through, so that's great to see. And that's it from us. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much from me as well, and thank you for your interesting questions as well. Okay.
Okay, bye everybody.
Bye.